that's why you get developments like net zero, where a notionally conservative government thinks we have to do all the things that the left wants. You have a political right that doesn't really believe in anything and that kind of hates itself. This country can't just be a theme park of the 19th century. The culture war is the reason why these issues have so much prominence now, but this is an economic question. Okay, you smashed everything, and now what?
Kristian Niemietz, you're the author of Imperial Measurement, an IA publication about the economics of British colonialism and slavery. So why shouldn't the British taxpayer be made to pay reparations?
Right, so the reparations argument is one that I'm not addressing in the book because I thought that's a slightly separate question. That's a question about whether you believe in collective guilt, and especially in the sense of whether you think that the people who live in a country at any given point in time can somehow be responsible for things that people who lived there in previous generations have done. What I'm trying to say in the book, so I would, first of all, to go to your question, I would simply reject reparations on those grounds. I don't believe in collective guilt, in guilt that can be inherited through the generations. But what I'm trying to do in the book is more about the addressing the question of whether it's true that the empire made Britain richer than it otherwise would have been, whether it was profitable, whether the British Empire was a source of wealth, because that's this idea that came up again as part of the Black Lives Matter protests, and then later various other social justice activists took it up. And I'm simply saying, no, on the whole, the British Empire was made at most a minor contribution, probably more likely not even that. It's quite possible that it was a loss maker for the simple reason that empires are expensive to maintain. You know, you have to, like nowadays, if we think about the British troops that were stationed in Afghanistan, it's just very expensive to maintain a foreign presence in that way and to administer foreign territory. And if you want to trade with people somewhere else, you can just do it. You don't need to colonize them for that. So compared to the more likely alternatives, it was probably not profitable.
Presumably, one of the main motivations in arguing what the BLM types and David Lammy and others on the left have been arguing in relation to this, that their motivation is really not just to trash Britain's history and reputation and to sully the idea of Britain in the minds particularly of young people who being taught this sort of stuff at school and in universities now, but also to trash the idea that capitalism can be successful without doing horrific things to people.
Yes, that's exactly what explains the popularity of this idea, that you have, on the one hand, an anti-Western wokeness. That's generally the fashionable belief that the West is bad and other parts of the world are more authentic and somehow represent a better way of life and purer moral values, and that kind of primitive anti-Westernism. You have that. And in the case of this story that Britain and other Western countries got rich off the back of colonialism, there you also have a negative and an original sin story, you could say, of Western capitalism, because it fundamentally shapes the way you see the world, where you see the origin of prosperity. If, like most economists, and certainly like me, you think that rich parts of the world are rich because they have good institutions and good policies, then you will think, well, that means if the poorer parts of the world want to be richer, they need to adopt the same good institutions or similar good institutions and similar good economic policies as the rich parts. And you will take the view that prosperity is something that policymakers can shape depending on the policy choices they make, rather than something that's fatalistic and predetermined and outside of your control. And whereas if you take the woke progressive view, then you will, well, firstly, you will think there's nothing that's especially good about the West, and there's nothing that is worth preserving about the West, about the West's institutions, policies, and other arrangements. You will just see the West as an aggressor, as a part of the world that got rich through exploitation and through plunder, and that's not something that's somehow worth admiring or imitating. It would just be the equivalent of a criminal gang, where, of course, it can work on its own terms. A criminal gang can get rich, but it is nonetheless not a model. You couldn't, a whole society couldn't work as a like a criminal gang. It only works as a pure zero-sum game. So it can work for the gang that comes out on top, but somebody has to lose in this way. And yes, it just promotes very much a zero-sum mindset. And that's why, some people were saying to me, you're an economist, why do you write about this culture war stuff? Why don't you stay out of it and talk about productivity and inflation? Whereas I'm saying, no, the culture war is the reason why these issues have so much prominence now. But this is an economic question. Why is the world rich? Is it because we plundered the rest of the world? Or is it because we created the institutions that you need for investment, for long-term productivity improvements, for innovation, for getting things right, for getting a more efficient division of labor, building up a bigger capital stock, that kind of thing. And I think it's just absolutely worth defending the idea that is what made the West rich, and that is what made other parts of the world that later adopted similar institutions like Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, or Chile, other parts of the world that grew rich later on, did it in this way, and not through some anti-colonialist struggle somehow declaring war on the West or anything, but rather learning from the good bits.
And presumably there's another example a bit closer to home. In fact, your country of origin, Germany, which industrialized, became economically successful in the 19th century like Britain, but didn't have an empire, or didn't try to create an empire until later.
Yes, so Germany was a late arrival in the colonial arms race, and by that stage, industrialization was already very far advanced, of course. So it wasn't until the 1880s, really. Before then, you only had a few, individual states. So the Kingdom of Prussia had a few minor colonial possessions, but it was on such a small scale that nobody could argue that had anything to do with the industrialization process. And even then, the German colonies were all comically unsuccessful in economic terms. So in their case, it's particularly obvious because they had profit and loss accounts. So like a private company, they published these accounts where they said, here's the money we raised, and here's the expenditure we incurred, and it's just clear the big ones of them were massive loss makers. The only ones that made a tiny profit are the ones that were a few islands somewhere where it was so tiny that's in the grand scheme of things, it's not even a rounding error. It's basically nothing. So there it's particularly clear. The colonies were a pure vanity project. It was purely about trying to keep up with the Joneses. The Joneses in this case being the British, of course the royal families being closely related, and Kaiser Wilhelm II had this idea under pressure from a domestic lobby group, a nationalistic lobby group, the Pan-German League, who said, well, the Brits, they have all these wonderful colonies, they have this massive empire, we need to have that too, and why can't we have that?
So it was kind of suburbanite envy, as you said. Yeah. If we wanted to tease the BLM types and their adjacent fellow travelers, is there not an argument for saying that imperialism and indeed slavery are themselves manifestations of socialism?
I'm all in favor of teasing BLM types, but I wouldn't do it in that particular way. I'd say it's more a form of corporatism. So Colonialism, even though you had private sector entrepreneurs doing it, setting up shop in other parts of the world, it was underwritten by government policy. So either if it was literal colonization, you would have the British Army marching in somewhere and then saying this is ours now. Or you would have organizations like the East India Company, which, okay, I guess, yes, it's a private company, but they were given monopoly rights by the British state, and so they monopolized trade with India. And without a monopoly of that sort, it's hard to see how a private company could behave like a colonizing state. You need that security that nobody else will come along and steal and take parts of your business. You need that monopoly right, and then basically you become like a state. If you're the only one who is allowed to do any kind of business on a particular territory, so it's very corporatist, and it was neither socialist nor capitalist. But it is fair to say that if the British state or any other state had just said to foreign merchants, to people who wanted to set up shop and invest elsewhere, if they had just said to them, that's your business, you're not going to get a penny from us, we're not going to help you, and if an enemy attacks your ships or whatever, that's your problem, sorry.
But it involved initially an act of massive nationalization, because the British Empire went and said, oh, this part of Africa or wherever is now ours, or India. And so was establishing state ownership over the totality of a geographical area. Now, obviously, then later it gave companies like the East India Company and, you know, the slave plantation owners, it gave them, subcontracted to them the rights to develop those places, but it initially did involve an act of state seizure.
Yes, it was state-driven, but that is still more in the category of, say, an aggressive industrial policy, or a Mussolini-type economy, if you want to. But it's not something that an actual socialist would have defended at the time, except maybe insofar as they might have said, well, maybe this is the way capitalism can arrive in other places, and every society has to go through a capitalist stage at some point. But I don't want to accuse them of things that they wouldn't have defended at the time, and that's where I see a difference between, say, if a socialist nowadays says the Soviet Union wasn't really socialist, they would say, well, come on, look at what your ideological predecessors said in the 1930s. They were all massively pro-Stalin, so you're just saying that now with the benefit of hindsight. But there weren't, as far as I know, socialists who defended colonialism, and for that. Well, we have to give them the credit that on that, at least, they were for once on the right side of history. There's plenty of material that we can attack them on. We don't need to go into the more. I mean, okay, you can make a more obscure argument that since it involved nationalization, but I say we don't need to go there in order to find material to attack the socialists on.
I mean, there were left-wing advocates of imperialism, like Lord Milner, who often fused their left-of-centre politics with Christianity, and so part of the justification for empire was, you know, that we were going to bring religion to the natives. But interestingly, I mean, obviously, most of the major defenders of imperialism were conservatives, who interestingly attacked liberal opponents of imperialism by calling them Little Englanders. That's where the term originated from.
Yeah, it was mostly because it was the liberals at the time who were against it, and partly on economic grounds, partly simply by saying Adam Smith in the 18th century already, and then the free traders, Richard Cobden, John Bright. And that's why I'm citing all of those people in the book as well, to show that there is this liberal anti-imperialist tradition. They did not just oppose the principle, the idea of colonizing other parts of the world, but also they made that argument that I'm making in the book, but having access to a lot more empirical material than they had, they already made the point that it's just not good economics, and that Britain should just dissolve the empire, or ideally never have created it in the first place. But once it was there, dissolve it immediately, and then just adopt a policy of free trade with the whole world.
I'm going to plug another one of your IEA publications, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. Are there real socialists in Britain today?
Yes.
Or is there an element of pastiche about Ash Sarkar and Paul Mason, Owen Jones and the others?
Well, I mean, there's definitely, so socialism nowadays, especially the so-called millennial socialism, which is mostly driven by young and middle-aged people, there is a lot of pastiche, and it's mostly vibes driven. It's mostly a lifestyle choice, and that's why, so Novara, for example, they have an online merchandise shop where you can buy gym equipment that says Marx, that kind of stuff. They're clearly selling a lifestyle product. But that doesn't mean that it isn't also a real ideology. So I would say that the fact that people are drawn into this orbit because they think this is the hip thing to do, this is the cool thing to do, that doesn't mean that it's not real. And it certainly doesn't, well, it certainly feels real to them. And you could say, well, if somebody is just attracted to that cool image, that rebel image, that's a very superficial way into an ideology, but nonetheless try to talk these people out of it, and then you will notice, okay, it may be skin deep, it may be something that's poorly thought out, but it feels real to them, and you cannot easily talk them out of it. So I wouldn't discount it on that basis. So it's clearly, it's the big advantage they have, that they can present their ideas as cool. And then you get lots of people who just want to be on the cool side. And that's an advantage that, say, libertarians or conservatives don't have. If we tried to sell T-shirts that say Hayek, I mean, we would say maybe sell 2 per year to some nerd from a Students for Liberty group or the Hayek Society of wherever. But so we don't have the option of winning the argument on with such a strategy, and they have. It's a massive advantage they enjoy, but nonetheless that doesn't mean that it's not real. You could say this about the 1960s as well, that the student protesters of the day, of course there was a generational vibe, and that if you talk to people who were at university, then they would say that was just the thing you had to do, and everyone was a Maoist, and everybody loved Ho Chi Minh, and that was just the vibe, and you just had to be, there was the group pressure to be part of it. It can start that way, but it can then also solidify into something that you really do believe. So I think this whole distinction between here's the vibe and the aesthetics and all that, and here's the real belief, there isn't really, you can't meaningfully separate those two. It's a bit like, I'd say political beliefs are mostly auto-suggestive. You can talk yourself into believing something that you want to believe, but that doesn't mean that, so say you adopt a political position because it's the fashionable thing to believe in your peer group. That may initially be your motivation, but that doesn't mean that you secretly believe the opposite. It doesn't mean that once the cameras are off, you would say, oh, well, actually, I don't believe a word of what I just said. I just have to keep up appearances. It's more that you are initially drawn to the image and you enjoy the positive social feedback, but then you tell yourself that's what you really believe, and it becomes real.
I think my point is not that they secretly believe something else, but that socialism for many of these kind of people, not, I think, what I would consider to be real hardcore classical Marxists, but for the Ash Sarkar types, certainly it's an aesthetic. It may be a sort of quasi-religious idea of an alternative sort of godlike agency that can correct everything that is wrong about the society. But these type of what I call pastiche leftists don't really ever now walk the walk intellectually in the way that the classical Marxists I remember from university did. They don't really articulate socialism and what that would actually mean in a sort of clear overarching concept. I mean, I'm thinking of your debate with Aaron Bastani, who is one of the most articulate and interesting, I think, of the modern kind of Marxians, if you want to call them that. But he, in his debate with you, or discussion with you, he didn't really ever articulate what socialism would actually mean in practice.
Well, okay, they wouldn't spell out a political program that you could implement. They're not going to say much about, say, how the process of economic planning would work, whether there would be a 5-year plan like in the Soviet Union, or whether it would be more like Yugoslavia with market socialism. They don't go into specifics of that nature. But again, that doesn't mean that it's not real. I'd say that has always been the case with socialists, going back all the way to Marx and Engels, where they also didn't just not say it, but explicitly refused to spell it out. Explicitly refused to say, here's what the socialist society of the future is going to look like. They specifically said this is pointless, this is speculation, we don't know that. The proletariat has to take power, and then in that process they will work it out, how to build the socialist society, and it's not something that we can somehow work out in advance. And that's always been there. You can draw a straight line from Marx and Engels through Lenin, who also had no idea, even weeks before the October Revolution. He wrote his book, State and Revolution, where it became clear he had absolutely no clue what to do once he was in power. He'd say, well, we'll just expropriate the capitalists and then the rest will take care of itself. It's going to be very easy. You will just need a few people who are able to read and write a bit, basic arithmetics. That's all it takes. It's going to be super easy. And then, of course, they only developed the program because then, once they were in power, they realized that that doesn't happen. The economy doesn't magically suddenly run itself. And then you had an economic collapse and a famine. And that's when they realized, oh, no, actually, we have to think about this stuff a bit. But it's always true that, well, not always, but it's usually true that socialist revolutionaries, before they come to power, don't really have much of a clue, because they think that there isn't much that you need to figure out. They think the capitalists are basically just parasites. They just sit there, collect profits. They fulfill no useful role. And if that's the way you think about it, then why would you need to somehow come up with a detailed plan? If the capitalists are just parasites, well, you just kick them out, and that's it. As with a literal parasite, if you had a worm somehow picked up from some dodgy food or so, you wouldn't think in detail, what do I do once that parasite is removed? Just get rid of it and that's it. And the rest takes care of itself. And that's how they think about it, and that's why they don't feel the need to spell out a program in detail.
But Lenin, to be fair to him, I mean, did put flesh on the bones, because for the reasons you've just explained, he did actually create a socialist state with centralized planning, and he put in motion the system that was to survive another 70, 80 years or whatever it was. So it seems to me that there is an example, whether you agree with it or not, of really existing socialism, but that Western leftists, except for the very honest ones, since the 60s and 70s, the sort of student type people, Rudi Dutschke and all those kind of student revolutionaries and others, they don't have the courage really to say that's what socialism will look like when we have destroyed capitalism. I mean, I had a discussion with a leading Green Party person who said, I'm an anti-capitalist. So I said, well, are you a socialist? And she reluctantly eventually said, yes, I think I am a socialist. So I said, well, how would it work? She said, oh, well, it's not for me to decide. It'll be a citizens' assembly.
Classic cop-out.
Yeah.
Well, that's just the way they've always done it. So even the Soviet 5-year plans, they were born out of that necessity. They were not part of the plan in advance. Lenin never, I think he never in his life mentioned the idea of a 5-year plan or a government planning committee. Never anticipated an institution like that. That was really just once they were in power and realized they had to organize the economy somehow. And Lenin, of course, then didn't live to see the first 5-year plan. So that was more than a decade after the revolution, and it just continues in that way, that you had other socialist revolutions elsewhere in the world where they were initially similarly clueless. And even though the 1960s, the Rudi Dutschke types, okay, they may have been earnest Marxists in the sense that they read difficult texts, but there is, what was it? I think it's a transcript or something. I've read this somewhere, a discussion between Dutschke and some of his fellow revolutionaries, where probably a critical journalist or so asks them, okay, now tell us about, imagine you guys come to power, and what does that look like? They can't do it either. They are just as confused. And Dutschke then also just says, no, you think of me as some kind of Lenin. It's not going to work like that. We'll figure it out once, and it's going to be part of that revolutionary process. It will all fall into place then. But the problem is always, okay, what if the revolution starts and things don't fall into place? But that's been the case from Marx through Lenin to in the 21st century, Russell Brand, when he had these 2 years or so, 2013 to 15, I think, when he was all over TV on Question Time and all these prime time political shows. And sometimes people did ask him, okay, and I think in his book he addresses it as well. What is your, and the book was called Revolution, so that does provoke the question, what does your post-revolutionary society look like? Okay, you smashed everything, and now what? And then he also just says, well, I don't know, I'm a comedian. We will figure it out together. They've always done this.
Something I would love to see would be you inviting Aaron Bastani, who to his credit is somebody who likes to engage intellectually in a way that I don't think many of his sort of contemporary hard leftists do. They don't seem to believe in debate now on principle, mainly for kind of wokey type reasons. But I would love to see a second leg with you interviewing him about his understanding of what a socialist society would look like and how it would operate, because I think you're probably more likely to get some sort of coherent response from Aaron in a way you're not going to get from your average member of the Green Party or the Socialist Workers' Party, whatever it happens to be.
Well, he does a bit in his book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, but he starts with just a hodgepodge of all the lefty ideas that were floating around at the time. So there's the Corbyn Manifesto, there's the stuff from Paul Mason's Post-Capitalism, and they've fallen out with each other since then, as lefties often do.
Over what?
I think it was once the Ukraine war started that Paul Mason turned against his former comrades, whom he suspected to be either pro-Russia or, on just general anti-imperialist grounds, having this Stop the War coalition mindset that everything the West does is bad, so therefore the West shouldn't support Ukraine. And Paul Mason is very pro-Ukraine and pro-Western assistance, and he's just fallen out with all of them. And I don't know whether Novara or that lot have ever specifically commented on that, but for Mason, they're all part of the Corbynite camp and generally correct. And he just hates all of them now. And that's, of course, mutual, that feeling. And he is now a political... where he's in a no man's land, where it's basically just him. He's a massive Starmerite, but he tries to justify that in Marxist.
Well, that was because presumably
words.
He wanted a seat in Parliament.
Yes,
he was sucking up to Starmer big time.
Yes, but he did it in a particular way. He called well, I don't know whether he literally calls himself a Starmerite, but he clearly supports everything Starmer says and does. But he also tries to frame that in Marxist language. So he now says, well, we're not in a revolutionary situation right now. The proletariat isn't quite ready for it. So Starmerism is just the next step on the way. It's all very bizarre, but that's just what these people are like. So Paul Mason is basically a live action role player. He tells himself that he lives in some Trotskyite text where the revolution will eventually happen, and he's been telling himself that for decades now, probably. So he had this book in 2011 or whatever, where there were several uprisings. So he was very keen on the Syriza movement in Greece at the time, and he was stationed there. He was based there during the time of their referendum, and that campaign then. That election leading up to the Syriza, Tsipras, Varoufakis government, and he thought that was going to be where the next socialist project is going to come from. And there were just lots of protests at the time, and he tried to somehow weave that into a story, saying, I think that was the title of the book, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere. He's been telling himself, the Trotskyite revolution is just around the corner. This time it will happen. And he sort of tells himself, okay, it's been delayed now because Corbyn didn't win, but it will still arrive. But okay, he's a separate subject. The only reason why I mention him is that he wrote this book, Post-Capitalism, where he outlines some ideas, and Aaron Bastani in Fully Automated Luxury Communism just puts together Mason's post-capitalism with the Labour Manifesto as it was, either the 2017 or 19 one, and says, okay, here these are the first steps, then describes the final stages, then you have superabundance and everything's great, that's Fully Automated Luxury Communism, skips over the bit in between. So you have a bit of Corbynism on that. He can be reasonably detailed because it's in the manifesto. Then you have this distant end goal. What happens in between, to be confirmed.
I thought one of the most interesting aspects of your debate with Aaron Bastani was when he said in an attempt to sort of catch you out, but can't you concede that China has taken 700 million people out of poverty?
Mm-hmm.
And then you say what your response was.
Yeah, well, they did, but that's simply, they did that by reversing everything, well, not everything, but a lot of the bad things they did during the first 3 decades of the existence of the People's Republic of China. So if you start with Maoism, with full-on socialism, and then you allow limited property rights, you allow price signals to work again, you allow foreign investment, you create something like free contracts, at least in some parts of the economy. Of course, you're going to get some economic progress, especially if you are able to provide effective institutions as well, and if Western investors can be reasonably sure they will not be expropriated, and if somebody, say, defrauds them, a Chinese court will not automatically rule against them just because they're Westerners, so that they can be reasonably sure that their property rights, their contract rights, that will be respected up to a point. Well, yes, then you're going to be able to grow out of the worst kind of poverty, and that's why China is now, and they're not a rich country. Usually the videos and the coverage that we see from China concentrates on the big cities. On the whole, they are roughly in line, I think, with the global average in terms of GDP per capita. So it's not that you would look at China and say, well, this is the brilliant development model, this is what the world has to be like. It's just relative to where they were starting from, such a low base. If you start with a peasant economy where people are literally starving, so the worst famine of the last century, if you start from that, then yes, you can have growth rates of 8, 9, 10% a year for a while. But it's really the non-socialist part of the economy that's what dragged them out. And okay, but Bastani, I remember, made that point that that's not really un-Marxist, because Marx would have said, well, you have to, your society has to go through a capitalist stage of development first, and once capitalism is fully developed, that's when socialism can happen. but it's just, if we look at how socialist societies have actually developed, we get a very different pattern. So it's not that a society can't industrialize under socialism. You can, if you start with a peasant economy like Russia in 1917. You can build up some industries under 5-year plans, under a centralized economic control. You can do that if that means you just import lots of Western technologies and you say, well, okay, this is how they do it in America or in Britain or in Western Europe. We will just copy and paste a lot of that. Up to a point, you can have industrial development under socialism. It's just that socialism is only good at doing the big and bulky stuff. So you can build up a coal industry, you can build up a steel industry, you can build up an iron ore industry. You can do the big things, but you don't get the sophisticated consumer services, the kind of things that determine really our living standards. So having, say, a Sputnik satellite in the atmosphere, okay, that may have been a matter of national prestige at the time. I'm sure this was considered very impressive in the 1950s, but it doesn't improve your living standards. You want a nice restaurant near you, a nice brewery, some good wine, and you're not going to get that under socialism.
I just love the way going back to the title of your book, The Failed Idea That Never Dies. So he tried to, having implied that the Chinese Communist Party had lifted all these people out of poverty, and then when you came back at him by saying what you've just said, he said, yes, but of course, this is a stepping stone towards actual socialism, without ever kind of really referring to what would be the content of this socialism that would enable people to live a good and a prosperous life.
Yeah, so the idea has the original Marxist idea was that capitalism is all well and good for a while. It's just a necessity. If you want to build up industries, only capitalism can do that. So it's a necessary stage that you have to go through. It's just that at some point it runs out of steam. It runs up against its own contradictions. You get the problem that capitalists want to increase production all the time, but then they also want to impoverish their workers, and then nobody can buy their products, and it creates crises. And so the Marxists thought it's fine up to a point, and then it will just run into crises, and then it will have to collapse. But that's not at all what we see. If we look at the economies that are most advanced today, that still is the United States. In Europe, Switzerland is the most advanced capitalist economy. In Asia is probably Singapore. So this is the frontier of what's possible, the production possibility frontier. They are also furthest away from a socialist revolution, or furthest away from the kind of crisis that Marxists were talking about. So if anything, they're doing better than, say, economies like Britain, which are, well, okay, clearly first world, but not the very richest. And if anything, the gap between the top tier economies, the US, Switzerland, Singapore type, and the second tier economies has been growing in recent decades. So if you believe the Marxist idea in its original form, you would think, well, nowadays it's probably in Switzerland where the revolution has to happen first, or maybe it's in Singapore.
Good luck on that one.
Don't see that happening.
Do you think that sort of mainstream leftism, Starmerite type people, do you think they're sort of developing actually a new third way type of statism? Because they're clearly not fully socialist, yet they still have this impulse towards ever more state regulation of the economy, but also civil society, ever more regulation, obviously, as we know, in relation to communication, to the media. Is social democracy turning into something that's sort of authoritarian and sinister?
I'd say so far it's just fairly standard social democracy, what we're seeing from the Starmer government. So we had the Rachel Reeves budget. That did mean a major increase in government spending and taxation. I think it was something like 2 percentage points of GDP or so, which is quite a lot for one single budget. But that's to be expected. So that's what you would expect to happen under a center-left government, and it's not really massively out of tune with what would have happened under a Tory government, or what was already happening under a Tory government. So even though leftists, including some of the Starmerites, like to talk about how we had allegedly 14 years of austerity, but actually public spending at the end of these 14 years of conservative rule was higher than it was in, well, certainly in the late Blair Labour years. So this expansion of the state, that's something that's happened under the Conservatives, and I don't really see a huge difference there. So we now have, if anything, you could say we now have a situation where government rhetoric and action are actually matching each other, rather than a Sunak-type government where conservatives still feel obliged to say positive things about the small state because they associate it with the 1980s and Thatcherism, and they think, well, those were the good days because we used to win a lot of elections. So they feel obliged to say that, but don't really believe it, don't really do anything about it. So if anything, we now have greater coherence. We have a government that clearly believes in a larger state and acts upon it.
But an added dimension, I mean, which obviously was also taking place under the Conservatives, particularly under Boris and Theresa May, but which is being added to massively by this government, is the desire to regulate not just economic assets, but to regulate civil society. So, for example, there's a new law about to be passed which will enable employees to sue their employers for things they hear from third parties during the course of their work, which is going to have extraordinary implications for, obviously, for employers, but also for the whole concept of free speech. So private conversations are now being sort of criminalized increasingly, or in this case, made liable for civil actions. I mean, that's taking things to a further stage, isn't it?
Yeah, so they clearly believe in social engineering, but again, that's priced in. That's what I expected from them, so no surprises there. And a lot of that was happening under the Tories already. The only difference is that you now have a government that actually believes it, whereas under the Tories you had these, well, it was mostly the Tory government, especially towards in the final year, so from May to Sunak, seemed to suffer from a kind of imposter syndrome. They thought that they accidentally ended up in government, but that society is fundamentally left-wing, or that the zeitgeist is left-wing, and that they shouldn't really be there, that they are somehow there by fraud. And that's why you get developments like net zero, where a notionally conservative government thinks we have to do all the things that the left wants because this is where society is heading, and we live in a left-wing age, and we are somehow we are just in government by accident. We shouldn't be there, and I guess it feels that way if you if you think of the last year of Theresa May, 2019, you had Corbyn still doing superbly well in the polls, and then you had Extinction Rebellion protests here every day. And so imagine going to work, I mean, as I did at the time, you walk through hundreds of left-wing protesters every day, and of course, you know, at some level, this isn't representative of the country as a whole. This is a self-selected audience, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like all the political energy, it's all coming from the left. They are the ones who are enthusiastic. And then you have a political right that doesn't really believe in anything and that kind of hates itself, and that is somehow torn between doing nothing and meeting the left halfway. And there was, I think must have been in the same year that we had Greta Thunberg visiting the country and giving her talk in Parliament, and you had senior figures from all parties, including Conservatives, well, listening to her, and there is this
genuflecting, in fact, at her knee, you know.
There is this photo, it looks extremely cringeworthy, that they all look at her mesmerized like some child priestess, including Michael Gove. So, of course, there's Miliband, and Caroline Lucas must have been there. So, and Leila Moran, I think. So, yeah, some people
yeah.
where you would expect it, but it was really across the board. And yes, I can kind of see if you are a conservative who doesn't have strong beliefs in a situation like that, you would think, I'm an imposter. I've somehow ended up in government, but I shouldn't be here. And that's how they governed, and that's why they, without much conviction, why a lot of the institutionalized wokery started then. So I guess it's a bit like Chancellor Healy in the late 70s, being having to implement a quasi-monetarist agenda, but without believing it really. And then you just had this change to a government that, the Thatcher government, that does it and that does believe it, and you now have that coherence again, where you have a government that that does what it actually wants to do, and if that has a sense of mission, and that's what we now have with the centre left. So you have people in charge again who do what they actually believe and want to do,
and that may lead to people on what we might call the centre right, I mean, which I call, liberalism essentially, re-evaluating what their political raison d'etre is. What is the purpose of a centre right political party like the Conservative Party, if it's not in any way offering an alternative agenda and worldview to this stuff? Why not just let the mainstream left govern for the rest of time?
Yes, so you do see a bit more on the centre-right conservatives, but also reform. They are now keener to engage in culture war topics, culture war arguments, than they were while they were in government. So the my Imperial Measurement book was, for example, mentioned positively by Kemi Badenoch. I don't think a senior conservative politician in the Sunak days would have done that. So there is more of a willingness to take on the left and to not just passively accept, okay, the left is winning, nothing we can do. So on the purely on the cultural side, yes, there seems to be some rethinking going on. We haven't seen that yet on the economic side, and that's where I see the main weakness actually of conservatives, and I can't see reform being any better. We've basically just had 14 years of economic stagnation as well, and that must have helped the left in lots of ways, that you just had the sense of, so imagine being a member of Generation Z, a Zoomer or late millennial, and say you come of age in 2008, 2009 or so, and throughout your whole adult life, you've never known the sense of living in a growing economy, living in an economy where you have the sense of we're going somewhere, good stuff is happening. It's all, okay, some indicators improving a little bit, others getting worse, but it's broadly stagnation or something very close to it. And that was clearly the Conservatives' fault, and they weren't. It's because Britain is a NIMBY economy. You can't build anything. You can't build houses, can't build offices, can't build retail space, can't build anything. There's always some NIMBY group saying no, not here. And conservative politicians feel the need to pander to that demographic, don't have the guts to say, well, sorry. But we actually want some economic activity to happen. We want a bit of prosperity. We can't. This country can't just be a theme park of the 19th century. Of course, we have to preserve some beautiful sites, and that's all well and good. But ultimately, we need to generate wealth. We need to live off something. And the Conservatives were just unwilling to do that for 14 years. And I don't see any rethinking there. And part of the problem that they have is that since they pandered almost exclusively to NIMBY boomers, baby boomers, there is now basically no such thing as a young conservative or even a middle-aged conservative. So they are almost exclusively a baby boomer or the pre-boomer generation project, the silent generation. And of course, those people, they're retired now, they are not as interested in economic dynamism as younger people would be. And that's just a difficult situation for the Conservatives. If they now said, okay, forget everything we did from 2010 to 2024, we will now be the party of prosperity. We will allow lots of projects. You want to build something, do it. Okay, the problem that if they did that, in the longer term, they could maybe change their image, but initially it would mean their vote among their current electorate, the boomers, would completely collapse. And it would take a long time before a new generation would think, okay, now I have a different image of this party. Now I might consider voting for them. And how they bridge that gap, that's something they haven't figured out. And aren't even thinking about.
In relation to that, I mean, the one particular problem they have is that the Lib Dems have taken, about 70 of their seats, predominantly in the South, and the Lib Dems are the ultra NIMBY party, while of course pretending at the same time not to be. So the Conservatives are trying to get these seats back in NIMBY land. Yeah. So they're in a really sort of, it seems to me, very difficult existential moment.
Yeah, this is clearly true. They have I don't want to say the party's finished, because I'm sure that that's something that people have said throughout the ages, and they are, I think, the oldest surviving democratic parties. They must historically probably got a few things right, but it is nonetheless true that if you look at a breakdown of voting habits by age, it really is true that there is a massive gap between. So age has become the principal, the best predictor of who you are going to vote for. If you're under the age of 40, you are a Labour voter. You just are. And with Conservatives, it's so heavily biased towards the retired generation that you could say there is basically nothing apart from that. That's pretty much the entire voting bloc. The trouble with that is, okay, if you have, it worked for them for a while, because among that group, the boomers, you had a very high proportion voting Conservative, but they're not making new boomers anymore. So. And people aren't growing into Conservatives. That's how they've deluded themselves the whole time, that the young are just going through a phase and they will naturally become Conservatives. It's complete rubbish. There's nothing natural about that. That happens because of specific life events, which no longer happen. And also, it's no longer just the 18-year-olds who are left-wing. Nowadays, so if you look at, say, the Novara media types there, the people who watch Novara media, I bet they're all in their 30s and 40s. Millennials nowadays, that's not teenagers. These are people up to their early 40s. There was that child actor who played Kevin in Home Alone. I think it must have been 2 years ago or so, Macaulay Culkin. He tweeted, "Hey guys, you want to feel old? I'm 40. You're welcome." And that's what happened with the millennial generation. We talk about them often. Conservatives in particular are guilty of this. They talk about millennials as if they were all 18 years old. No, the oldest millennials are in their early 40s. And if they still haven't abandoned their youthful leftism, they're not going to.
Though, as Lenin said, going back to him, sometimes worse is better, comrade. So maybe the left will, they are having their moment in this country, and maybe people will wake up when they see the results of even sort of social democratic stroke corporatist government. But I have to move on to a last question, which I ask everybody. Imagine you have a sort of Trump-like superpower. You're the president, the head of state in Britain, and you have tremendous kind of executive orders you can
It's only a matter
execute.
of time, really.
Sorry?
That's only a matter of time, really.
Well, we can only hope, obviously, to, you know, you might become the liberal equivalent of Lenin. But how would you exercise this superpower? What institution would you reform, abolish, or create, or law?
Yeah, I'm guessing some viewers will expect me to say the National Health Service, because that's been one of my ongoing obsessions. But if I had to pick one, it wouldn't be that. It would really be the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 and everything that followed from that. I would go back to a system where if you own land, you have a right to build on it. And if somebody wants to override that, the burden of proof is on them. They should have to prove that that land is, there is really some overwhelming strategic reason why you shouldn't be able to do with it as you please. So restoring development rights, it sounds like okay, this is urban planning, this sounds like a nerdy niche topic, but I really think this is at the heart of the stagnant economy, that economic activity needs to take place somewhere. We need entrepreneurs being able to set up new businesses, and for that they need business premises, and we need people to be able to move to those places, and for that you need to build housing, and the workforce needs to be able to move to where the jobs are, and that's in the southeast, at least the high productivity, well-paying jobs. We need to build loads of housing, especially in London, Oxford, Cambridge, in Bristol, Bath, the places which are very NIMBY dominated. Their NIMBY power absolutely needs to be broken. They should have no right whatsoever to stop the growth of their cities, because they're not their cities. They just got there a bit earlier, and that's where that's how you could really liberate the economy.
Kristian Niemietz, thank you so much for talking to me.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure to see you again.
Likewise.